Good morning, students. Welcome to week 3 of political sociology, and this is the week we will be discussing, I guess we could call it electoral sociology. There are some connections between what we're going to be doing today and what we have been doing, at least last week, in terms of the articles by Frank and my piece on the double backlash boomerang, and also Nancy Fraser's piece. So to some extent, this is a continuation, but it also provides you with some additional insights, concepts, theories on how we understand political dynamics, largely in the United States. So, important for you to grasp these things, given what's happening in the world at this moment in the United States. And there's a lot to say about that, but I'm talking about in the context of the political races that are taking place. So before we get started, I wanted to touch on a few items that either I didn't discuss in earlier lectures or which I need to introduce in order for you to expand your intellectual horizons. All right. So let's see if I can move these slides from over here. All right. This was a slide that actually was included in one of the PowerPoint presentations, I think week 1. And the reason I'm presenting this is because there's an enormous amount of attention in the media by the Democratic Party constantly pointing out after Trump makes some idiotic, ridiculous statement, or he has a press briefing and he makes claims that are simply absurd, and they say he's lying. He's lying again. He's a liar. He has told this many lies during his entire administration. Well, I understand how this can upset people, and I understand why they harp on this, but my point is that it's essentially counterproductive. It's a waste of time to point out that Donald Trump is lying. That's the first point I want to make, right? Because everyone knows that. And you're not going to convince anybody now, based on a lie he tells, that somehow that is going to sway them one way or another with regard to Donald Trump. But there is a very important distinction to be made. And this was made by a philosopher. His name is Harry Frankfurt. And he wrote something quite some time ago. So it's a short piece. He's an internationally world-renowned philosopher. And he wrote a book. Some people call it a pamphlet. And the title is On Bullshit. Now, you might say, Jaffe, this guy is a internationally known, highly respected intellectual academic philosopher. What kind of title is that, On Bullshit? Well, this just goes to show you that, just as in sociology, philosophers study just about anything, and they bring insights to ways we understand the world that we had not had prior to their contributions. Now, Frankfurt makes a distinction between lying and bullshitting. And the point I would like to make, and other people have done this, that is, they've read Frankfurt's work, they've observed Donald Trump, and they have written pieces that Trump isn't lying, he's bullshitting, okay? And I have the title of one of the media pieces on this at the bottom of the slide. And the basic point is that liars know they're deceiving you, and they understand that there is truth, and that there is value in truth, but they don't want to tell you the truth, so they tell you something that isn't factual. But they know that they're lying. They know they're being deceptive. And that's a certain level of acknowledgement and consciousness that liars have. Trump does not operate that way. When Trump says things, he has no concern with the truthfulness, the factualness of what he's saying. He says the things for the effect they have, for how it impacts the people who are listening. It's a rhetorical device. He has no interest, no concern with facts, with the truth. That's bullshitting. And remember, where does Trump come from? He comes from the real estate sector, right? He's a builder. He builds, high rises. He builds hotels. He sells real estate. He tries to get people to invest. That takes a lot of bullshit. Okay. Lots of people say what we need is a businessman. Well, there's a lot of bullshitting that goes on in the business world, and he's a master bullshitter. So, it doesn't do us much good to constantly say, I can't believe what Trump did. It's such a lie. It isn't factual. It isn't truthful. What are we going to? Don't waste your time. Okay. He doesn't care. His followers don't care. They're responding to the message and the way it's presented and the effect it has on them emotionally. That's bullshitting. Okay. So I think that's an interesting way to take something that was written before Trump got in office and became a prominent political figure in the United States and president by Frankfurt. And here we are taking the concept of bullshit and bullshitting, okay, and applying it to political speech. Share that with your friends and parents. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right. Here's another piece I came across. I just want to share this with you briefly. And that is that, let me see if I can move my screen. I'm going to try something here. Okay, this is not going to work. Yeah, there it is. Okay, I don't know if you can see that, but it was blocking some of the text. Okay. There were some arguments, among the Democratic Party during the primary, and, some people were supporting Sanders, who was not a mainstream candidate. He was not a centrist candidate. He was on the left wing of the Democratic Party. That's largely why he was so popular, because he wasn't a Democratic centrist, and people had enough of that Democratic centrism, and you've read about some of that. Hopefully you've actually read, that is, opened it up, looked at it on the screen, and read the entire article. If you did, you will have learned something, and you will be smarter, and you'll be more intelligent. If you're not doing the reading, you will remain ignorant, okay? That's a little editorial comment. So if you read that, you do know that the Democratic Party has to, emphasize the fact that, you got to have these moderates, you got to have these centrists. Voters will not vote for people who are outliers or more extreme candidates on the left or the right. So there was an interesting study done by this political scientist, and I have to say, sometimes I criticize political science because I think sociology and the way we study politics is richer and more interdisciplinary. But I have to say, there's been a lot of good political science research that's been done recently, and I'm going to actually cite some of that today because I think that they're making some good contributions. So anyway, the title of this, I do love the title of this, right? I mean, the key to getting something published is to come up with a flashy little title. Man bites blue dog. I like that, okay? A blue dog Democrat. Okay. You know what that is? Look it up, okay? I can't tell you everything. You have to autodidactism. You need to look up some stuff yourself. Man bites blue dog. Are moderates really more electable than ideologues? Well, that's the assumption in American politics. That's the assumption in political parties. And so people say, well, that candidate, he's a little too far out there. He's not going to appeal to the center of the political spectrum where presumably most of the voters are. And this shows that historically it's been the case that moderates tend to do better. But over the past several cycles, it turns out that candidates that are more on the far end of the spectrum, left or right within the party, and it's pretty narrow to begin with, they've done pretty well, and they've done as well as moderates. So the point is, you can win elections by taking a more extreme, if you want to call it that, perspective, or one that deviates from the middle of the road, the moderate, the centrist position. I think that's very important. Okay. All right. Let's keep going here. Albert Hirschman was a political economist, no longer alive, wrote wonderful stuff about economic development and political dynamics. I will touch on something else that he worked on and wrote about that pertains to different kinds of ways to argue about policies. But he came up with this beautiful, wonderful, what I'll call a conceptual triad. And one of the things I mentioned and something I sent out to you today was, what is do you know what a concept is? Because when I ask for two concepts, you need to know what a concept is in order to extract and identify concepts that you find in the readings. Right? Exit, voice, and loyalty. So he came up with this little conceptual triad. And basically his point is that, when you're facing a kind of unsatisfactory situation, you're dissatisfied with the existing state of affairs. Okay, this could be the political party that you're in. This could be your workplace. You can apply this to many different situations. Okay, and that's the key. That's why I emphasize concepts, because they're durable, because you can apply them as a framework to make sense of things that are out there happening. So, exit, voice, and loyalty. What the hell does he mean by this? Let's suppose you have a job and you're not happy. You're dissatisfied. You're poorly treated. You're poorly paid. Working conditions suck. He says when you find yourself in these kinds of situations, and that's just one example, you have three options. Exit, leave, find another job, right? That's sort of the market response, right? Or if you don't like the customer service at a business that you frequent, I'm going to exit. I'm going to take my business elsewhere. I'm going to take my money elsewhere, right? If you have a job you don't like, I'll just quit, okay? That's one option, right? The other option is voice. Now, this is very different. This isn't sort of operating in this kind of market mentality that as an individual, I will simply move and go somewhere else as if you have the unrestricted freedom to do that. Voice is the democratic response. That is, conditions are unsatisfactory. You speak up. You try to do something to exercising your ability to express your dissatisfaction. Maybe voice would involve organizing with other people to change the conditions you don't like. Albert Hirschman wanted people to think more about exercising voice rather than exit, because he placed a high value on democracy and the ability of people to engage and express themselves and to voice their concerns and to ultimately, because he believed in progress, that was the avenue to making things better. And loyalty is simply, well, these people hired me. I'm talking about, the job you have that you don't like. They hired me. They're paying me. I'm just going to be loyal to the company, even though I'm not that happy. I'll just go along with this. So that's one example. Here's another example, and this came up actually in 2016, where you had the people who were supporting Bernie Sanders, and I guess you could say it's happened again in 2020. What do they do about the Democratic Party? They're not happy about the Democratic Party. They're not happy that Bernie Sanders, they believe, was treated poorly, that perhaps there was a scheme to undermine his candidacy during the primary. And so what do people who maybe are registered as Democrats do, even though they're very dissatisfied with the Democratic Party? Well, there's exit. That's it. I'm done. I'm going to go vote for another party. I'll vote for the Green Party. I'll vote for some kind of socialist party, whatever, or I just won't vote at all. I'm going to have nothing to do with the Democratic Party. That's sort of the outside strategy. There's an inside strategy, because people talk about outside, inside. You got to do both. What's the inside strategy? You organize within the Democratic Party with other people who share your views about the way you want the party to move, and you change the party. You understand? And then loyalty. I'm a member of the Democratic Party. I'm going to support the party no matter what, even though I don't like the candidate, even though I don't like the way the primary went, even though I thought that maybe one of my candidates that I preferred was treated unfairly. Those are the choices. Okay. Now, often what happens when people are engaged in certain kinds of protest activities, for example, People will say, love it or leave it. I don't know if you've ever heard that slogan. I heard this a lot when I was growing up, and I would protest the Vietnam War and other aspects of American society and foreign policy and imperialism. And I was critical of the United States, and I didn't stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance in high school. People said, love it or leave it, Jaffe. Now, what are they saying here? They're saying you have two options: loyalty or exit. Not voice, right? They cross out voice. This is a very undemocratic response. And you hear this all the time from people, right? Largely conservatives. Love it or leave it. Love America or leave America. Right? Exit or exhibit unconditional loyalty. But don't voice your complaints. Don't criticize. Don't protest. Okay. So you can see how this conceptual scheme applies to a lot of different situations. Okay? Trying to provide you with some tools. Concepts are tools. You can use them. And once you are able to use them and apply them, your brain will be working at a much, much higher level. It's one thing we would probably want students to do, is for their brain to work at a higher level. All right. I cannot use my remote mouse in VoiceThread. Robert Merton. Some of you have heard of Robert Merton if you're a sociology major. Hopefully, he was one of the major preeminent social theorists in sociology during the post-World War II period, writing in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And I've always liked some of the concepts that he presented. One was the law of unintended consequences. Some of you are familiar with this. I talk about it in almost every one of my classes. It's a vital conceptual tool. You've probably heard this, or maybe something like the law of unanticipated consequences. And there are sociologists, one sociologist in particular, Alejandro Portes, who argued that the law of unintended consequences is the single most significant contribution sociology makes to sort of understanding and making sense of what happens in the world. That's a pretty powerful statement. So what is the law of unintended consequences? What Robert Merton basically said was that there are lots of instances where you have agencies, organizations, institutions putting in place certain kinds of programs and policies. And these programs and policies are intended to achieve a goal. So you put in place certain conditions as the means to achieve ends, to achieve some goal. However, what Merton points out is almost inevitably, any policy or program or strategy will have unintended consequences. That is, there will be consequences that you had not intended or that you did not anticipate. This gets at this concept that I also emphasize in my class, paradox. Okay? It's paradoxical. Law of unintended consequences. The war on terrorism produces more terrorists. That's a classic case of the law of unintended consequence. Obviously, the war on terrorism is designed to extinguish terrorism. In fact, it had the opposite effect. When we launched the war on terrorism, everything's a war. Remember that. So just think about all the wars that the war on poverty, the war on drugs, et cetera, unintended consequences. So, you go out and you take a military approach to a problem, which is terrorism. Well, you begin to invade and occupy other countries and expand your military might across the globe. You piss people off. You piss more people off, and they get pissed off, and they become, quote unquote, because that's just a label you put on people you want to kill, justifiably kill, terrorists, right? So you can think of lots of instances, and I ask my students in my intro class to do this, Think of an example of some policy that was put in place in some workplace that you were in, or maybe in some school or something, and how it had unintended consequences. And often, quite often, what happens is the unintended consequences, totally nullify the very ultimate purpose of the policy, the program, the strategy to begin with. Okay. Law of unintended consequences. This is something everyone needs to understand. Now, two other concepts that Merton presented, they go hand in hand: manifest functions and latent functions. And basically, he said policies, institutions have what are called manifest functions. An institution has a manifest function, and there's latent functions. The manifest functions are the publicly stated reasons for an institution or a program or a policy or a strategy. The publicly stated reason. And the latent functions are the unstated, but often equally important function of that institution or policy or program or strategy. Let me give you an example. The example I often give in my classes. The institution of higher education, or educational institutions generally. If you ask somebody, what is the purpose of education in American society? And they'll say, this is like the manifest function. This is the officially stated reason. Education is designed to provide citizens with the skills needed to be successful in a modern economy. Now, that tells you almost nothing. Okay, as a sociologist, you would say that's just bullshit to some extent. Okay, it doesn't tell you very much. It's the standard party line, right? But you hear this kind of thing all the time. Now, what are some of the latent functions of education? The unspoken. Well, sociologists focus on these because we focus on the underside, the dark underbelly of the social world. Okay? Well, actually, educational institutions are designed to indoctrinate people to accept the conditions that exist in our society. Indoctrination. This is not unusual in the United States. It's the case in any educational institution within any society where the elite are able to manipulate the curriculum. What's another latent function? Another latent function of education is it prepares people to operate in bureaucratic organizations and institutions, which they will have to navigate through their entire life. Education is organized bureaucratically. If you're successful in educational institutions, you have sort of internalized this bureaucratic ability to navigate through the bureaucratic maze that is prominent in almost every organization. So it prepares you for your life in a bureaucratic society. Nobody ever says that. Nobody says, well, the reason we have education is to indoctrinate students. The reason we have education is to prepare people for... No, those are unspoken, but they're equally important. Another latent function is education is a way to legitimately allocate resources unequally. Right? Legitimately allocate resources unequally. People say, well, how come that person makes more money than me? I mean, that's not, well, they have more education. Oh, well, then that's okay. Right? The inequality is legitimized. It's legitimate because somebody has more education. We could go on and on. Okay, those are a couple functions. So let me give you a great example now to apply this to something that happens politically. Over the last 10 years, we have all these efforts, largely by conservatives and Republicans in different states, to institute all kinds of additional voter registration requirements for voters. Like you have to have a special ID, you have to go someplace and get a form, you have to register here, you have to make sure you register every 2 years, all kinds of new requirements. Now, somebody asked them, why do you have these new requirements? They say, well, there's voter fraud. There's a lot of voter fraud. Does anyone want voter fraud? No, nobody wants voter. So in order to ensure that we don't have voter fraud, we need to put in place some additional restrictions on voting that ensure that the elections are not plagued by illegal, fraudulent activities. That's the manifest function, right? Now, as it turns out, people have studied this question, and the level of of voter fraud is so minuscule that it doesn't justify any of this, right? So then you ask yourself, well, what's the real reason? They said the manifest function is fraud. What's the latent function? Well, the latent function is that they know instituting these requirements will place a greater burden on particular populations, poor populations, marginalized groups, Black and brown citizens in particular communities. And as it turns out, coincidentally, those people who have the most difficult time meeting those requirements tend to vote for the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party that is promoting this. Right? That's a great example, right? Manifest function, latent function. So the latent function is essentially to reduce the ability of people to vote who would be voting for the party that you oppose. And by the way, there's been lots of research to show that this is the case. In fact, in the effort in North Carolina, the term was that the policy was designed with surgical precision to ensure that Black voters in North Carolina would be less likely to obtain the necessary requirements to vote. Okay, so it's thrown out. They're still trying this. They're not going to give up. So that's an example. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to apply these two concepts to one particular issue, this issue of voter registration stuff. Okay. Now, law of unintended consequences. This is a beautiful story. So as all this is going on and voters out there in these communities, largely minority communities, begin to become aware that there are these efforts to put in place these voter ID requirements and restrictions that make it harder to vote. We had an election, and I can't remember which election this was when it was most prominent. Maybe it was 2012, the election. Anyway, we had an election, and something phenomenal happened. There was an amazing, sharp increase in voter turnout in communities where voter turnout tended historically to be very low, where people just didn't participate. There's a lot of non-voting. Lines around the block of people waiting to get into the polling place. Somebody did a little research on this. Why are all these people coming out to vote? And the reason they were coming out to vote, some of them said, look, I don't normally vote. I'm not crazy about the two-party system. I'm busy. But I heard that somebody is trying to restrict my ability to vote with these voter registration requirements. So you know what? Even though I normally don't vote, I'm going to vote, damn it. I'm going to show them. I'm going to show up, and I am going to exercise my right that they are trying to take away. Tell me that is not a beautiful example of the law of unintended consequences. When the Republicans and conservatives were trying to put these policies in place, they were trying to minimize the level of participation. The unintended consequence was that individuals, knowing about the policies, decided they would essentially act in opposition to what they could see was the latent intended purpose. All right? So you have the law of unintended consequences, you have manifest and latent functions, you take these wonderful concepts, and you can tell a beautiful story about the voter registration issue. All right? You're welcome. Okay, I want to move into this question of political party polarization. Lots of people talk about that, the polarization in the United States. The parties are so polarized. And I've thought about this a lot. And there's something to the polarization point, and I'll get to that. But I think it's been misconstrued. And there are a lot of misconceptions. So I call it the myth of political party polarization. And I'm focusing primarily here on the political economic dimension, okay? The political economic dimension versus maybe the social cultural dimension. We'll talk about that. We touched on that a little bit the first week. So what I have here in this slide is theoretically, what would polarization look like? So I simply take an example. In 1970, you have the Democrats, and they're a little left of center. You can see that. And the Republicans are a little right of center. And people say that the parties are becoming more polarized. Okay. This is what polarization would actually look like. That is, you would have the parties moving in opposite directions toward opposite poles. You understand? The Democratic Party would be moving more to the left. The Republican Party would be moving more to the right. So this is theoretically what party polarization would look like. Okay? What, in fact, has happened? Both parties on the political, economic dimension have moved to the right. Okay? They both have moved in a neoliberal direction. Hopefully you understand that now from last week. And what that means is that rather than them moving in opposite directions, they were moving in the same directions. But notice here, it's possible for the two parties to move in the same direction, but become further apart. You see that? You can see that in my stylized little diagram here. The Republican Party moves sharply to the right on neoliberal economic policies, political economic policies. The Democrats move to the right, not as dramatically, but still in that direction. As you should know now, both the Democrats and Republicans have both essentially practiced neoliberal political economic policies, promoted them. And I have those dollar signs there because much of this is driven by money, by corporate donations. That's becoming increasingly important to both parties. And of course, those corporate interests prefer, of course, it's only rational, neoliberal economic policies. Now, the larger story, narrative, which I'm going to continually try to reinforce, and hopefully you understand this. As the parties have both moved to the right on the political economic dimension, and this started for the Republicans, obviously, with Reagan, for the Democrats with Clinton. Okay, Clinton was pretty much a hardcore neoliberal Democrat. So as the two parties begin to move to the right on neoliberal economic policies, the voters perceive less and less difference between the two parties, and they also experience no significant differences in the quality of their economic conditions. Republican Party comes in, Democratic Party comes in, right? And so the perception is that there really isn't that much difference between the two parties on the political economic dimension, on political economic policies that affect people's livelihood and material welfare. Inequality continues to increase. Economic insecurity continues to increase, right? So what's left? If they don't perceive much difference between the two parties on the political economic dimension, then that increases, the point I'm making here, the salience of social and cultural issues. Now, on social and cultural issues, the parties are further apart in more significant ways, right? And here's the problem for the Democratic Party. And maybe, as Frank has said, they basically have abandoned and given up on the working class because they're pursuing these political economic policies that are neoliberal. But the point is that if social and cultural issues become more salient, more significant, a more significant reason for choosing one party or the other, the case is that working class voters tend to be, on average, socially, culturally conservative. And so by moving in a neoliberal political economic direction, by not promoting what I would call more social democratic political economic policies, which the working class supports, they look at the two parties and they say, well, I guess what's different about them is the social and the cultural issues. And the Republicans promote social cultural issues in a way that draws working class people to them. Okay. And this is what immigration, identity, religion, these are the issues that often sway, right, the working class to the Republican Party. I don't see that the Democratic Party is providing any kind of economic advantage. This is the dynamic we see in American politics. This is the dynamic that Frank highlights in all of his work, from What's the Matter with Kansas all the way to Listen, Liberal. All right. So think about what real polarization is. I mentioned that money drives it, so I'm just going to put up this little diagram here, and you can locate the document that this comes from. But basically, it's showing how over time the role of big money has become more and more significant, both for Democrats and Republicans. Both Democrats and Republicans, two parties, heavily dominated, heavily dependent on the wallets and the checkbooks of the rich and the wealthy. And we'll talk more about the significance of that when we talk about an investment theory of politics. Partisanship in the Trump era. And I wanted to highlight something, and now I see that what was highlighted in my slide is totally covered up in this slide. So I will skip this slide and come back to it, where you can read what I highlighted. This is another study. The last one was by Bartels. What Bartels was basically saying, and what I wanted to highlight in that abstract, was that there's much more unity within the Republican Party on social and cultural issues. Within the Democratic Party, there is far less unity on these social and cultural issues in terms of a segment of their constituency who tend to, as I noted before, are a little more conservative on these social and cultural issues. And this is another angle on this question. How do parties decide which issues to emphasize during electoral competition? And the key point that I want to highlight here goes back to what I just said a couple slides ago. Rightist parties, that would be the Republican Party, will opt to emphasize values-based issues, especially in those cases where social demand in the electorate for values-based representation is high. And so when we talk about what they call values-based issues, we're talking about social, cultural issues. And the Republican Party has used these very, very effectively to draw people who, given their economic situation, given their social status, you would expect them perhaps to vote for, support a left-leaning party, if there was a left-leaning party, right? But if the issues that are going to be emphasized are not the economic bread and butter issues that affect their material life, they will be drawn to parties that appeal to these other social, cultural, what they call values-based issues. So there's lots of evidence for what I'm trying to argue here. Now, I said polarization is a myth. There is a certain level of polarization, and I give it a couple different names, a few different names, as I've thought about this. First of all, there is when we talk about polarization, let's talk about partisanship, right? Let's not talk about polarization in terms of the two parties becoming, one is going left, the other is going right. That has not happened, okay? The Democratic Party did not go left. The Republican Party went way right, and the Democratic Party went slightly right, and the distance between them has grown significantly. Zero-sum partisanship. This is the dynamic that exists that energizes this idea of polarization. What do I mean by zero sum? partisanship. In a zero-sum game, a zero-sum logic, what it means is that a gain for one side is automatically a loss for another. You understand? A gain for the Democrats will be automatically interpreted as a loss, a cost to the Republicans. A gain for the Republicans will automatically be regarded as a loss and a cost to the Democrats. So when you have this kind of dynamic, what I call zero-sum partisanship, you're going to have increasing levels of polarization. And in fact, Lee Drutman wrote a book on the two-party doom loom. He talks about this. I actually came up with this several years ago, this idea of zero-sum partisanship. And it's nice to see that some of these scholars are using that term to describe what's happening. So clearly this is the case. We have a dynamic where one party believes that they have to stop the other party from doing anything positive, because if they do something positive, it will be a cost to them, right? A non-zero-sum game, we talked about this earlier when we talked about the labor capital accord, is a gain for the other side. Yes, it is a cost, but it also benefits us because we get something done, we get some policy instituted, that kind of stuff, right? So right now we have zero-sum partisanship, which intensifies the polarization. We also have this, what I call binary partisanship, right? You're either a Republican or a Democrat. It's a binary system. When we think about a binary system, 0 and 1, right? You can't be somewhere in the middle. You're either 0 or 1, right? So in the binary partisanship dynamic, if you criticize a Republican, you're automatically assumed to be a Democrat. And not only that, but if you criticize a Republican, you're automatically put in the position of having to defend the Democratic Party because you're either a 0 or 1. You're either a Democrat or Republican, right? So, for example, when I used to, which I did a lot, I criticized George W. Bush, okay, during his 2 terms. Horrible, horrible president. Okay, he's been elevated because Trump is so bad that he looks relatively good. I would criticize George W. Bush, and people would say, yeah, but Clinton. I'd say, why are you talking about Clinton? Well, you criticized George W. Bush, so I'm going to criticize. I said, I'm not talking about Clinton. In other words, you by default, by criticizing George W. Bush, I was automatically assumed to be, in the binary system, a supporter of Bill Clinton. I would say I'm not talking about Clinton. I wasn't a fan of Clinton. I don't support Clinton. Doesn't matter. Okay. This is the binary. You're either in one or the other. Very, very unhealthy dynamic for any kind of principled nonpartisanship, which we talked about earlier in the semester. Very difficult to sustain that kind of perspective when you have zero-order partisanship. You have binary partisanship. I would criticize Obama when Obama was president. Okay, I criticized both parties. And people would say, or let me put it this way, I would make critical comments about Obama in the classroom, and students would automatically assume that I was a Republican because that's the way our brains work now. Okay? We have this binary system. Then I talk about codependent partisanship. Codependent. The parties are codependent. As much as they hate each other, they depend on each other. You understand? It's a dysfunctional relationship, but it's codependent because the Republicans can't mobilize their voters unless they can point to the horrors of the Democratic Party, which they're doing now, right? They're saying that you better vote for us because Biden is a radical socialist. By the way, I'm a socialist. Biden is no socialist, okay? But anyway, that doesn't matter. The point is you vilify the other party as a way to gain voters to support your party. and vice versa, right? So the Democratic Party says, "Oh man, the Republicans. I mean, look at what they say. Look at the comments that their leaders make. How ignorant they are and horrible. And you have to support us because you can't obviously support them, right?" I always, say, like, what would the Democrats do if the Republicans didn't exist, right? And vice versa, right? Because that is the way they try to recruit supporters, is by pointing to and vilifying the other party, right? I would get calls from the Democratic Party would call me, and they would say, it would always start out this way. They would say, "You're not going to believe what the Republicans are proposing now. We have to stop them. We have to stop them from doing this. It's horrible, the policies they're proposing. Could you please contribute?" Of course. "Could you please contribute some?" What I always say is, "Well, what are you proposing?" "No, we have to stop I said, "But what are you proposing? I know you want to stop what they're doing, but what are you proposing? What's the proactive policy, platform, program that you want to put in place? Not just stopping them." Right? And this always threw them off, because it's like, well, the main point is we just have to stop Somebody came up with a term for this called fortress liberalism. Fortress. That is, you create we can't let them go any further, right? We can't let them go they've gone far enough. The right, the neoliberal model, the extreme republic, they've gone far enough. We're going to stop them here. And a lot of people like me say, well, I don't just want to stop them. What is the alternative policy, program, political, economic system we're going to put in place? All right. Before I said you don't have this polarization, they're not going to separate poles. You have what's called, and I didn't have the term for it. Here's the concept. By the way, all of these are concepts. Okay, if you don't know what a concept is, we've gone through a bunch of concepts. Norm Ornstein, Andrew Hacker, and his colleague Pearson, I forget his first name. That's the concept that gets at what I was talking about. They're both moving to the right, but one is moving sharply to the right. Asymmetric polarization. Symmetric polarization would be that theoretical model. Symmetric. Okay? Asymmetric polarization is one is moving sharply, the other doesn't have to move at all. But the point is, if one is moving radically in one direction, even if one stayed where they were, you would have polarization. Okay? Asymmetric polarization. That's the term. Great concept. Thank you, Norm and Andrew and his colleague. There was a book written some time ago, probably 8 years ago now. Time is flying in my head. It seems just like yesterday when I read this book. By Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann. It's even worse than it looks. That's the title of the book. These are two political scientists. And this is what they wrote about the Republican Party. And this is what we mean by asymmetric polarization. The Republican Party has become an insurgent outlier, ideologically extreme, contemptuous of the inherited social and economic regime, scornful of compromise, unpersuaded by conventional understandings of facts, evidence, and science, and dismissive of the legitimacy of its political opposition. These are not radical political scientists. They're actually very mainstream. And Norm Ornstein is associated with the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative think tank. But basically, they're just describing what's happened to the American political party system. And they point to the Republican Party because people say, well, both parties have gone to. No, it's not true. I wish the Democratic Party had moved further to the left. I have to tell you that, but they haven't. The Republican Party is the outlier. I wrote a piece. You can go to my blog. The title was The Republican Party and the Lunatic Right. And I basically said that the Republican Party today is a lunatic right-wing party. I don't take that back. I don't care if people are offended by that. That's a description. There have been lunatic left-wing parties, but in the American context, we've got a lunatic right-wing party, and it is the Republican Party. And that's my bias. Now, the zero-order partisanship, the binary partisanship, the codependence partisanship, all of this is a direct result and only possible, okay? That form of partisan polarization I talked about, that I think does exist, is only possible because we have a two-party system. And you really, really need to understand this. The United States is an outlier in terms of the number of parties that are viable and that people can choose to govern them. It is ironic because in the United States, choice is glorified. The more choices you have, that's what freedom is to have lots of choices. So when you go to Publix, you have 35 different types of orange juice. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't it amazing? Capitalism provides us with so much choice. Choice is glorified. Then you get over to the political system where, to me, it would be a little more meaningful. Only two. Why only two? Okay. To understand why we have the two-party system that we do is not because the American people have demanded that we have two parties. It's because we have an electoral system known as, let's see if I have this on the next slide, okay, known as single-member district. And when you read Druckmann, one of the articles, and the book is, look at this, I'm using it right here. There it is. Excellent book. I just finished it over the summer. And you are the fortunate, lucky students that get to read a chapter. So to understand his argument, you need to read that chapter. I'm not going to present it, but the point I want to make is that we have a particular kind of electoral system. It's known as single-member district, first past the post, winner take all. You get 50.3%. You represent that district. What about the people that, 49.7? Tough shit, okay? When you have a winner-take-all, what's called single-member district system, you will inevitably have a tendency toward two parties. And those two parties, as they have in the United States, we call it a duopoly. Think of monopoly, duopoly. Those two parties will do everything they can to ensure that third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties are not viable. Okay? But as long as we have a single-member district, first past the post, winner take all, we will have a two-party system. And the point Druckmann tries to make is that the two-party system in the United States is the most significant source of the political dysfunction that exists, as well as the undemocratic aspect of American society. I know you think we live in a democracy. Okay, he offers a variety of alternatives, and those alternatives. Let's suppose we had a multi-party system. Let me just give an example: a proportional representation. In a proportional representation electoral system, you have lots of parties running. Let's say one party gets 15%, another party gets 10, another party gets 25, another party gets 40, another party gets 60, whatever. The percentage of vote is translated into number of seats in the legislature. So you have a range of parties. They represent different political economic philosophies and programs and policies. People can vote not for the lesser of two evils, which is the standard way people vote in the United States. They can actually choose for a party they believe in that represents them. And it won't be a wasted vote because the percentage that party gets will be translated into seats in the legislature. We don't have that, okay? We don't have that kind of system. Instead, we have the two-party system. Think about all of the zero sum. Think about the zero sum. Think about the binary. All of that kind of partisan polarization would be eliminated, right? Would be eliminated because there would be multiple parties. So it wouldn't be, well, a gain for the Republicans is not a gain for the Democrats. It's, well, Republicans, but there's all these other parties that might gain as well. So that whole dynamic, that polarization doesn't exist at all. Also, when you have more parties, turnout is higher. People are more likely to vote. There's plenty of evidence on this. There's a positive correlation between the number of parties and turnout. And this is a diagram. I don't think this was in the chapter I gave you. So when you read Drutman, take a look at this. This is what he means by the two-party doom loop. And you can see that it's kind of a vicious cycle. If you don't believe me that we're an outlier, and he has this is a table. Again, I don't think it was in the chapter you read. What this shows you is American exceptionalism. I like to use that term because we are so exceptional in ways that we don't want to be. You can see that the United States has the fewest number of viable, effective political parties in the industrialized world. Okay, this is the OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the kind of countries we would be comparing ourselves to that have elections. We have the fewest number of parties. This has to change. That is the point that Drutman is trying to make in his book. But he goes through the history of the parties, the way they've evolved. He talks about a four-party system. When you had conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats, you had liberal Republicans, you had conservative Republicans. He called that a four-party system. There was a greater ability to not see things in zero-sum, so things have the political party system has, to a large extent, developed and evolved in a particular way over the last 40 or 50 years that has brought us to this highly polarized state. I'm going to have to stop at 60 minutes. I'm getting close. Let me see what's next. Okay, I'm going to stop here because I want to say a little more about this, and I will be back. The second half will be shorter because we're getting toward the end, I think. Hopefully, you have developed some new ideas, ways of thinking about the American political system. You understand polarization in a much more nuanced way. And the issue of the relationship between polarization and the political party system. Okay. All right. I'll be back for part 2. I will see you then, or I'll pretend that I'm seeing you then.